You look beautiful.
Thank you, but you are getting married soon.
I know, but I can't help how I feel.
She had 17 days left before she disappeared from his life forever. He had one unannounced visit, 0 explanations, and enough silence to cancel a wedding that had taken 2 powerful families 2 decades to arrange. The dangerous part wasn't what Hak Jin-yoon saw in her apartment. The dangerous part was what he recognized. If you've ever been the most important person in someone's room, and the last one they admitted it to, this story is going to hit different. Like, subscribe, and come with me. Because Hak Jin-yoon is about to make the most dangerous decision of his life. She was already awake when her phone lit up at 5:47 a.m. Not because she had slept poorly. Zaria Okoye slept the way she did everything else, with discipline, with intention, and on a schedule that did not negotiate. She was awake because her brain had decided, somewhere around 3 a.m., that sleep was a luxury she had temporarily forfeited in exchange for staring at a ceiling and replaying a conversation that had lasted less than 4 minutes and rearranged something fundamental inside her chest. You should have left before I noticed. She had read the note 11 times. She had counted. She told herself she was analyzing it professionally, the way you analyze a threat assessment. Identify the variables, quantify the risk, determine the appropriate response. She was very good at this. She had built an entire career on being very good at this. The note was not a professional communication. She was aware. Zaria sat up, pressed both palms flat against her thighs, and looked at her apartment the way she imagined he had looked at it, with fresh, unwilling eyes. It was small, 42 square meters in Mapogu, which in Lagos terms was a storage closet, and in London terms was a reasonable studio, and in Seoul terms was simply what you accepted when you were a foreigner who had not come here for comfort. She had made it warm anyway, because warmth was something she carried in her bones regardless of square footage. There was a woven throw her mother had sent from Ibadan. There were 3 plants on the windowsill that she had kept alive for 14 months through sheer stubbornness. There was a bookshelf that was more honest about her interior life than anything she had ever said out loud. And there was, sitting on her desk exactly where she'd left it, her resignation letter. Signed. Approved. His signature was precise. Unhurried. The kind of handwriting that had never rushed anything in its life because it had never needed to. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she got up, showered, dressed in the gray blazer that meant I am completely composed and absolutely nothing happened last night, and took the subway to work. This was a mistake, obviously. The gray blazer was doing significant emotional labor for which it had not been designed. The Yoon Group's Seoul headquarters occupied the top 6 floors of a building in Gangnam that had been designed to communicate one thing. We are not explaining ourselves to you. The lobby was the kind of marble that didn't echo, it absorbed. The elevators moved silently. The staff moved silently. Even the air seemed to have been briefed not to draw attention to itself. Zaria had walked through those doors 5 days a week for 14 months. Today, the lobby felt like it had eyes. She was being ridiculous. She knew this. Nobody in this building knew what had happened last night. Nobody had seen Hak Jin appear at her apartment. Nobody knew about the note. As far as the Yoon Group's 847 employees were concerned, this was a perfectly ordinary Wednesday morning. She smiled at the front desk. Minji, 23, anxious, perpetually over-caffeinated, and rode the elevator to the 31st floor. Her office was adjacent to his. A glass partition separated them, which had always struck her as the building's most committed architectural joke. Glass. As if proximity required a transparent reminder. As if anyone needed to see exactly how close and how separate 2 people were simultaneously. She sat down, opened her laptop, began her morning review with the focused efficiency of a woman who had decided that feelings were a scheduling problem and she simply needed to block out adequate time for them later. Perhaps Thursday. She'd check her calendar. At 7:02 a.m., Hak Jin walked in. Dark suit, no tie. The particular stillness he carried like a second coat. He walked past her glass partition without looking at it, which was his default, and which she had long since catalogued as simply how he moved through a room, rather than anything personal. Except this morning, 3 steps past her door, he stopped. He turned. He looked directly at her through the glass. His expression was exactly what it always was. Controlled, unreadable, assembled with the kind of precision that suggested it had been engineered rather than grown. She looked back, held it, because Zaria Okoye did not flinch and she was not starting today. 4 seconds. 5. He turned and continued walking. She exhaled and thought, 17 days is a very long time. By 9 a.m., she had handled 4 communications, rerouted a meeting, and intercepted a situation involving a junior liaison and a document that was never supposed to exist in digital form, the kind of small catastrophe that happened regularly in organizations that operated in the interesting gap between legitimate business and consequences nobody documented. Standard morning. At 9:23, his intercom clicked. Miss Okoye. His voice was the same as it always was. Low. Even. The kind of voice that didn't need to raise itself because it had never needed to compete. Sir, the Busan briefing. Move it to 11. Done. Click. She moved it to 11. This was the entirety of their interaction for the next 4 hours, and Zarya found this both professionally appropriate and privately maddening, which was information she immediately filed under not relevant and returned to her work. What she did not know, what she could not have known from behind that glass partition on an ordinary Wednesday morning, was that at 11:47 p.m. the previous night, Hak Shin-yoon had called So Yejin's father, not Yejin, her father. The conversation had lasted 8 minutes, and somewhere in those 8 minutes, 2 families' worth of careful architecture had been quietly, permanently, and without apology, demolished. Zarya would find out about this the same way she found out about most things that mattered, not from him, not directly, and not before it had already irrevocably changed the shape of everything. She would find out at 2:14 p.m., when her phone lit up with a message from a contact she trusted inside the circles that didn't officially exist. Yoon called off the CO engagement. Last night, no statement. You know anything about this? She stared at the message, then at his door. Then at the resignation letter, still sitting on the corner of her desk like a quiet detonation waiting for someone to decide what to do with it. 17 days. She typed back, no. And for the first time in 14 months, Zarya Okoye told a professional contact something that was not quite the full truth. Because the real answer was more complicated than no. The real answer was, I know exactly what this is, and I have a one-way ticket to London, and I am no longer sure which decision I'm more afraid of. But that didn't fit in a text message. And the gray blazer was already working hard enough. Hak Jin-yoon canceled a wedding that 2 powerful families spent 20 years arranging because of what he saw in one woman's apartment. Do you think what he did was right, or did he just blow up everyone's life on an instinct? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you believe a man should choose what's real over what's convenient, like and subscribe. Only people who think power should always win over honesty won't. The problem with working for a man like Hak Jin-yoon was that he never explained himself. Not to his lawyers, not to his lieutenants, not to the 2 senior directors who had been with the Yoon organization for a combined 37 years and still occasionally looked at their employer the way you look at weather, with respect, with wariness, and with the private understanding that you do not ask whether why it does what it does. You simply prepare for it. So when word moved through the 31st floor that the wedding had been canceled, nobody asked questions. They adjusted. This was the organizational culture Hak Jin had built. Not through cruelty, though he was capable of that, but through a particular brand of expectation. He expected competence. He expected discretion. He expected that the people around him would understand that his decisions were not invitations to discussion. They were announcements, the kind that arrived after the fact and required only acknowledgement. By 10 a.m., 3 of his senior staff knew. By noon, all 6 floors knew. By 1 p.m., the knowing had arranged itself into the careful silence of people who had opinions and had correctly assessed that those opinions were not currently an asset. Zarya watched all of this from behind her glass partition with the focused attention of a woman who had spent 14 months learning to read this organization the way other people read weather. She saw the micro adjustments, the slightly longer pauses before people spoke near his office, the way Minji from the front desk had arrived on the 31st floor on a transparently fictional errand just to absorb the atmosphere and report back to the floors below. The way Senior Director Lim had walked past Hak Jin's closed door twice in 40 minutes without knocking, which for a man of his seniority was the professional equivalent of pacing. Everyone was waiting for something. Zarya was waiting too. She simply had better posture about it. At 2:47 p.m., his door opened. Hak Jin walked directly to her desk. Not her doorway, her desk, which he had done perhaps 4 times in 14 months, because Hak Jin-yoon summoned people to rooms, he did not come to them. The 4 previous occasions had all involved situations of significant operational urgency. She looked up from her screen with the expression she had spent 14 months perfecting, attentive, composed, professionally pleasant. The expression that said, I am your assistant and I am very good at my job and absolutely nothing else. He placed a folder on her desk. The Jeju account, full audit. I need a discrepancy report by Friday. She looked at the folder, then at him. The Jeju account was closed in March. I know. A pause. I'm reopening the review. She held his gaze for exactly the amount of time that was professionally appropriate and pulled the folder toward her. Friday, she confirmed. He didn't move immediately. This was new. Hak Jin-yoon delivered instructions the way other men threw stones. Clean release, immediate departure, no waiting to see where they landed. He did not linger. He was lingering. Zarya kept her eyes on the folder. Is there anything else, sir? Another pause. The kind that had texture. How are you finding the transition timeline? She looked up. His expression was assembled, controlled, but there was something operating just beneath the surface of it. Something that she recognized from the night before, standing in her apartment doorway, the way a man looks when he's doing arithmetic on something he doesn't want the answer to. It's manageable, she said carefully. 2 weeks is sufficient for a proper handover. I haven't identified a replacement. I can prepare a candidate brief. I know the role requirements better than anyone. Something moved across his face, gone before she could name it. Do that, he said. He walked back to his office. The door closed behind him with the same quiet precision everything in his world closed. No slam, no drama, just the soft, absolute sound of a decision being made. Zarya looked at the folder, then at the closed door. Then at the resignation letter still sitting in the corner of her desk like an uninvited guest nobody had gotten around to removing, she thought. He came to my desk to give me a folder he could have sent digitally, asked about a transition timeline he has never mentioned in 2 weeks, and told me he hasn't found my replacement. She was a crisis management professional. She recognized a man creating reasons to have conversations. The gray blazer made a sound that was almost sympathy. At 4:15, her phone rang. Unknown number. Seoul prefix. She answered. Miss Okoye. A woman's voice. Polished. The particular politeness of someone who had been raised to use manners as a form of pressure. My name is Seo Yejin. I think we should meet. Zarya was quiet for exactly 1 second. I don't believe we've been introduced, she said, which was technically true and professionally impeccable, and also somewhat beside the point given that they both understood precisely why this call was happening. No, Yejin agreed pleasantly. We haven't. That's rather the problem, isn't it? Outside the glass partition, Hakjin's office light burned steady. Zarya looked at it. When? She said. Seo Yejin had chosen the kind of cafe that didn't appear on any public review platform. Not because the coffee was bad. The coffee was exceptional. It didn't appear on public platforms because the people who came here were not interested in being reviewed, photographed, or accidentally overheard by someone with a phone in poor judgment. It was the sort of establishment that understood its clientele the way a good lawyer understood their client. Completely, discreetly, and without requiring the details to be spelled out. Zarya arrived 3 minutes early. She sat with her back to the wall because 14 months inside Hak Shin-yoon's world had rewired certain instincts permanently, and she no longer sat any other way in unfamiliar rooms. She ordered tea. She opened nothing on her phone. She simply watched the door with the patience of a woman who had learned that the most important information usually arrived in the first 7 seconds of a person entering a room. Seo Yejin arrived at exactly the agreed time, which told Zarya the first thing she needed to know. This was not a woman who was falling apart. Grief, when it was real and unmanaged, made people late. It made them slightly underdressed or slightly overdressed. It put a particular kind of brightness in the eyes that had nothing to do with happiness. Yejin was immaculate. Ivory coat, hair perfect. The composed expression of someone who had been performing composure since childhood and had long since stopped distinguishing it from the real thing. She sat down, looked at Zarya directly. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? Zarya asked. Yejin tilted her head slightly. Someone more obviously threatening. Zarya considered this. Would that have made it easier? A pause. Something flickered across Yejin's face. Not quite amusement, not quite pain. Something that lived in the neighborhood of both. Probably, she admitted. The tea arrived. Neither of them touched it immediately. There was a particular negotiation happening in the silence. 2 precise women calibrating how honest to be with someone they had no reason to trust and every reason to take seriously. Yejin spoke first. I want you to understand something. I'm not here to threaten you, perform jealousy, or ask you to stay away from him. I've seen that scene. It's beneath everyone involved and it accomplishes nothing. Then why are you here? Zarya asked. Because I've been engaged to Hak Jin-yoon for 14 months, Yejin said. And in those 14 months, the only time his voice changed, the only time it carried anything that resembled actual investment, was when he was talking about something you had done, something you'd handled, something you'd anticipated. She paused. He never said your name the way people say an assistant's name. Zarya was quiet. I want to know, Yejin continued, if you're leaving. My resignation has been approved. That's not what I asked. The cafe made soft, ambient sounds around them. Someone laughed at another table. The espresso machine exhaled. Ordinary life happening at a polite distance from this very specific conversation. I have a ticket, Zarya said carefully. Tickets can be refunded. I'm aware. Yejin looked at her for a long moment, then she picked up her tea. He canceled the wedding because of what he saw in your apartment. Not because of anything I did or didn't do. Not because of our families or the arrangement or 14 months of correct behavior from both of us. Her voice remained even, composed, the kind of composed that costs something. He canceled it because he walked into your space and saw evidence that you were leaving, and something in him could not reconcile that. Zarya said nothing. I spent 2 years being appropriate, Yejin said. I attended every event. I wore the right things. I said the right things. I made myself into the correct answer to a question his family was asking. She set the cup down. And then you almost bought a plane ticket, and he undid all of it in one phone call. The words landed with a quiet weight that Zarya had no clean response to, because there was nothing defensive to say. Nothing professionally appropriate that covered this territory. The truth was the truth. And it sat between them like a third person at the table. I'm sorry, Zarya said, and she meant it. Yejin looked at her sharply, as if apologies were not what she had come here for and were somehow more difficult to receive than hostility would have been. Don't, she said quietly. I don't need that from you. Then what do you need? Yejin was silent for a moment. I need you to understand what you're walking away from, she said finally. Not for my sake. I've already made my peace with the fact that I was always the arrangement and never the choice. Something passed through her expression, clean, brief, honest. But if you leave, he won't come after you. Men like Hakim don't chase. They cancel weddings and write cryptic notes, and then they go absolutely still and wait to see what the world does next. And if you get on that plane, she stopped. If I get on that plane, Zarya said quietly, he waits. He waits, Yejin confirmed, and eventually he stops. Zarya walked back to the subway station alone. The evening had arrived in Seoul the way Seoul evenings did. Without apology, neon pressing against dusk, the city shifting from its business register into something louder and less disciplined. She moved through it with her hands in her coat pockets and her mind doing the thing it did when a problem exceeded its normal parameters. She thought about Yejin's face when she'd said I was always the arrangement and never the choice. She thought about a man who remembered she didn't take coffee after 7. She thought about a note in precise handwriting that said you should have left before I noticed, which was either the most restrained declaration she had ever received or the most elegant way of saying this is your problem now, and she genuinely could not determine which. She thought about London, the consultancy, the clean start. The version of her life where she did not spend her days behind a glass partition being professionally invisible to a man who had apparently been noticing her the entire time. She stopped at the top of the subway stairs, looked at the city, thought, 14 months. Thought, one-way ticket. Thought, he waits and eventually he stops. She went down the stairs. She did not yet know what she was going to do, but she had 13 days left to figure it out. And for the first time in 14 months, she was no longer entirely sure that the exit was the safest direction. Thursday arrived with the particular energy of a day that had decided to be difficult before anyone had finished their first cup of anything. By 8 a.m., Zarya had already intercepted 2 communications that should not have existed, rerouted a conversation between a junior associate and someone he absolutely should not have been talking to, and discovered, buried inside the Jeju account audit Hakshin had placed on her desk the previous afternoon, a discrepancy that was not an accident. She sat with this information for approximately 4 minutes. Then she closed the folder, placed it precisely in the center of her desk, and stared at it the way you stare at something that has just made your life considerably more complicated than it was 90 seconds ago. The discrepancy was not large. That was almost the point. It was the kind of number that was designed to be overlooked, small enough to pass under routine review, structured in a way that suggested someone who understood exactly how the Yoon organization's accounting architecture worked. Someone internal. Someone with access to closed accounts and the specific knowledge required to move money through them without triggering the automated flags. Someone had been skimming, carefully, patiently, for what her preliminary calculation suggested was approximately 8 months. Zarya looked at the folder, then at Hakjin's closed door, then at the calendar on her screen, which informed her that she had 12 days left before she was no longer anyone's problem inside this organization. She thought, of course, naturally, why would the last 2 weeks be straightforward? She opened the folder again. By 10 a.m., she had traced the architecture of it with the focused efficiency of someone who had spent 3 years at an international security consultancy, learning exactly how money hid itself inside legitimate structures. It was almost elegant, in the way that termites are almost elegant, quietly structural, deeply patient, and catastrophic if left alone. The money was moving through the Jeju account into a series of subsidiary holdings that existed on paper with the wholesome innocence of companies that had never done anything interesting. Except 3 of those subsidiaries shared a registered director. A name she didn't recognize. She ran it through the internal directory. Nothing. She ran it through the broader network contacts Hakjin maintained, the ones that didn't appear in any official system but existed in a encrypted document she had access to, because 14 months ago he had given her a password without explanation, and she had simply filed it under things. I now know that I cannot unknow. The name appeared once, cross-referenced to a senior director, Park Sung-ho, who had been with the Yoon organization for 11 years, who sat 3 offices down the hall, who had just this morning brought Hakjin a report on the Busan logistics restructure, and smiled with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed his paperwork was clean. Zarya closed the encrypted document, sat very still, thought. 12 days. Thought. This is not my problem. Thought. Except it absolutely is, because I found it, and I am the only person in this building who has found it, and I know exactly what happens to organizations when internal theft goes unreported, and the people responsible realize someone is close to the thread. She looked at Park Sung-ho's office through the glass. He was on the phone, leaning back in his chair with the posture of a man entirely at ease with himself and his choices. Zarya pulled up a clean document and began writing. She knocked on Hakjin's door at 11:34 a.m. Come. She entered, closed the door behind her, which she did not typically do for routine communications, and which he noticed immediately, because he noticed everything, which was the foundational problem of this entire situation, and placed her preliminary report on his desk. The Jeju audit, she said. I've found something. He looked at the report, then at her. How significant? Significant enough that you asked me to review a closed account rather than anyone else, she said. I think you already suspected something was wrong. A pause. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise, but the particular quality of a man whose suspicion has just been confirmed and who is recalibrating accordingly. How long? He asked. 8 months, possibly longer. I'd need the full historical records to be certain. Who? She held his gaze. I need 48 more hours to be absolutely sure before I give you a name. I won't hand you a conclusion I can't defend with documentation. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that took inventory. You have until Friday morning, he said. She nodded, turned to leave. Miss Okoye, she stopped. You could have flagged this through the standard reporting channel. Yes, she agreed. You came to me directly. The standard reporting channel, she said carefully, involves Park Sung-ho's administrative oversight. Silence. She watched him process this. Watched the pieces arrange themselves behind his eyes with the quiet efficiency of a man whose mind worked like a precision instrument, even when the information it was processing was the specific variety of betrayal that came from someone who had been trusted. His jaw tightened, once. Almost imperceptible. Close the door on your way out, he said. By 3 p.m., Zarya had the documentation. Complete. Airtight. 8 months of carefully disguised theft totaling an amount that would have been genuinely impressive if it weren't so comprehensively stupid. Because the fundamental error Park Sung-ho had made, the error that all patient, careful, internally positioned thieves eventually made, was assuming that the person who would eventually review the closed account would be someone less thorough than Zarya Okoye. He had miscalculated. At 3:47 p.m., Senior Director Park Sung-ho walked past her office. He glanced in, nodded pleasantly. She nodded back. He continued down the hall, phone already at his ear, entirely comfortable in the architecture of a life that was approximately 17 hours from complete structural collapse. Zarya watched him go, then looked at her screen, at the documentation, at the resignation letter still sitting in the corner of her desk, then at her calendar. 12 days. She thought about London, about clean starts, about the version of herself that got on the plane and built something new in a city that didn't know her name or her history or the specific texture of a particular man's silence. Then she thought about 8 months of theft going undetected by everyone in this building except her. She thought about what that said, not about the organization, about her, about what she was actually worth to the man behind the closed door down the hall, and about whether worth and want were finally dangerously, starting to feel like the same thing. Friday arrived like a verdict. Zarya had not slept well, which she resented on principle. She was not the kind of woman who lost sleep over men or decisions or the particular combination of both that had been occupying the architectural center of her life for the past 72 hours. She was the kind of woman who identified a problem, built a containment strategy, executed it cleanly, and moved forward. The problem was that she had identified the problem. The containment strategy was the issue. She arrived at the office at 6:15 a.m., 48 minutes before anyone else on the 31st floor, and placed the completed audit report on Hakshin's desk personally. 43 pages, every figure sourced, every subsidiary mapped, every transaction dated, cross-referenced, and documented with the kind of thoroughness that left no interpretive room whatsoever. On the last page, the name. Park Sung-ho. 11 years of loyalty. 11 years of correct behavior and organizational devotion and knowing exactly where the bodies were buried, metaphorically, and in this particular organization, occasionally less metaphorically. 11 years, and then 8 months of quiet, patient, catastrophically misjudged greed. She had attached a single handwritten note to the front page. Complete. Defensible. Yours to act on. Then she went back to her desk, made tea, and waited for the day to begin. Hakshin arrived at 7:03 a.m. He picked up the report before he removed his coat, read the first 3 pages standing at his desk, then sat down and read the rest with the stillness of a man who had received bad news before and understood that the appropriate response to it was not noise. At 8:30 a.m., Park Sung-ho arrived on the 31st floor with his usual untroubled energy, the particular morning confidence of someone who had not yet been informed that their carefully constructed world had been completely and professionally dismantled overnight. He made it as far as his office door. Hakjin's assistant, Zarya, was already standing outside it. Mr. Park. Her voice was even, courteous, the kind of courteous that had stopped being warm. Mr. Yoon would like to see you. Something crossed Sung-ho's face, quickly, gone before most people would have caught it. But Zarya had spent 14 months reading the micro-expressions of a man whose face was controlled to a professional standard, and after that, everyone else was essentially an open book. He knew. Not specifically. Not yet. But somewhere in the animal part of a guilty person's nervous system, the alarm had just sounded. Of course, he said pleasantly. He walked into Hakjin's office. The door closed. Zarya sat back down at her desk. What happened in that room over the next 22 minutes was not something she witnessed directly. She didn't need to. She had worked here long enough to understand that Hakjin Yoon's version of confrontation was not loud. It was not dramatic. It did not involve raised voices or theatrical displays of anger or the kind of scene that required cleanup afterward. It was quiet, specific, and it left no room for negotiation or reinterpretation or the particular brand of desperate creativity that guilty people employed when they were trying to explain their way out of 43 pages of documented evidence. At 8:52 a.m., Park Sung-ho walked out of Hakjin's office. He did not look at Zarya. He collected 3 personal items from his desk, a photograph, a small plant, and a pen that had probably been a gift, and walked to the elevator. The doors closed. 31st floor exhaled. At 9:15 a.m., Hakjin appeared in her doorway. He leaned against the frame in the way he occasionally did when a conversation was not going to be brief, but was also not going to be conducted from behind his desk, a posture that existed somewhere between professional and something that didn't have a clean professional name. The documentation was complete, he said. I said it would be. You traced 8 months of concealed movement through 3 subsidiary structures in 48 hours. The architecture wasn't as sophisticated as he believed it was. A pause. Most people in your position would have flagged it to compliance and let the process run, he said. Most people in my position, she said carefully, don't know that the compliance oversight structure had a conflict of interest. You protected the organization. I did my job. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that particular quality of attention that she had spent 14 months pretending not to notice and was finding increasingly difficult to pretend about. You're still leaving, he said. Not quite a question. Not quite not one. My resignation stands, she said. Something tightened in his expression. Brief. Controlled. I want to discuss your terms, he said. She looked up from her screen. My terms are in the resignation letter. I want to discuss different terms. The morning light came through the office windows at an angle that did Hakjin Yoon no particular harm, which Zarya considered cosmically unfair given the circumstances. She looked at him steadily. What terms? She asked. He straightened from the doorframe. Dinner, he said. tonight. The word landed in the room with the specific weight of something that had been decided before it was spoken. Zarya considered approximately 14 responses, discarded 13 of them. The gray blazer, which she was wearing again because apparently it had become her emotional support garment, made no sound whatsoever. Unhelpful. "That's not a term," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." A silence settled. The kind that asked questions neither of them had technically asked out loud. She thought about Yejin's voice in the cafe. He waits, and eventually he stops. She thought about a one-way ticket with 10 days left on the clock. She thought about a man who had never said thank you and had said her name instead, the way you say something you've been thinking about. 7 o'clock, she said. Something shifted in his expression. So small that someone who hadn't spent 14 months cataloging the precise geography of his face would have missed it entirely. "I'll send the address," he said. He went back to his office. Zarya looked at her screen, then at the resignation letter, then at the window. She thought, 10 days. She thought, this is either the smartest thing I have done in 14 months or the most comprehensively catastrophic. She thought, I genuinely cannot tell the difference anymore, and that is itself important information. Her tea had gone cold. She drank it anyway, because composure, at this particular juncture, was a full-time occupation. The address he sent was not a restaurant. Zarya stood on the pavement outside a private residence in Songbukdong, the kind of neighborhood that didn't announce itself, where old soul money lived quietly behind stone walls and mature trees that had been growing longer than most of the city's ambitions. The house was set back from the street, understated, the architectural equivalent of a man who didn't need to raise his voice. She had changed 3 times before leaving her apartment. This was information she was keeping strictly between herself and her wardrobe. She had settled on a deep burgundy dress that said I made an effort without saying I made an effort for you specifically, a distinction that felt important. She had worn her hair up because it was armor, and she was not walking into this particular situation without armor. She had stood at her door for 45 seconds before leaving, which was 44 seconds longer than she typically spent second-guessing any decision. Then she had thought, Zarya Okoye does not stand in doorways, and she had left. A man she didn't recognize opened the gate. No introduction. He simply stepped aside. She walked through. The interior of the house was not what she expected, which was itself instructive. She had expected the aesthetic of Hakjin's office, controlled, precise, cold in the way that expensive things were sometimes cold. A space designed to communicate rather than inhabit. This was different. It was quiet in a way that felt chosen rather than constructed. There were books, actual books, not decorative ones, the kind with cracked spines and the comfortable disorder of things that had been read. There was art on the walls that seemed selected because someone liked it rather than because it appraised well. The lighting was low and warm. It looked, she thought with some surprise, like a home. Hakjin was in the kitchen, which was not a sentence she had ever expected to construct. He was not cooking in the sense of performing domesticity for an audience. He was simply cooking. A jacket draped over a chair, sleeves rolled to the elbow. The focused, unhurried attention he brought to everything redirected towards something that smelled extraordinary and required his actual hands. He looked up when she entered. "You found it," he said. "The address was precise," she said. "Unlike some of your other communications." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Almost. "Sit down, Miss Okoye. We're having dinner in your home and you're calling me Miss Okoye." "Zarya," he said, immediately, quietly, the way he'd said it 6 months ago after the crisis that had no clean solution, like a word he'd been holding and had decided to put down. She sat down. They ate at a table that could have seated 12 and was set for 2, which under other circumstances might have read as theatrical but somehow didn't. The food was simple, precise. The kind of cooking that didn't need to impress because it was confident in what it was. Grilled fish, seasonal vegetables, rice that had been prepared with the specific attention of someone who understood that the difference between acceptable and extraordinary lived in details most people skipped. For the first 20 minutes, they talked about nothing that mattered. This was Zarya understood, not avoidance. It was calibration. 2 people who communicated primarily through professional precision finding the register for something that had no professional framework. She talked about Lagos in the dry season. He talked about a summer he had spent in Jeju as a child, before the account that bore its name had become a vehicle for someone else's theft. They spoke carefully, the way you speak when the conversation underneath the conversation is louder than the one you're having, and you've both agreed without discussing it to arrive there slowly. The wine was exceptional. She noted this. He noticed her noting it. "You're cataloging," he said. "Professional habit. You catalog everything. It's kept you considerably safer than you'd have been otherwise. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I know. 2 words. But the weight in them was the weight of 14 months, of every crisis she had absorbed, every problem she had solved before it became his problem, every late night and canceled meal and invisible act of professional devotion that had happened inside the machine of his life without ceremony or acknowledgement. I know, he said again, differently the second time. She looked at him across the table. Why did you cancel the wedding? She asked. Direct, clean. Because she was tired of carrying the question, and they were past the point where professional circumnavigation served either of them. He set down his glass. You know why. I want to hear you say it. A pause. The particular pause of a man who chose words the way other men chose weapons, carefully, with full awareness of consequence. Because I walked into your apartment, he said, and saw evidence that you were leaving, and I realized I had been operating under the assumption that you would simply always be there. He looked at her directly. That assumption was not something I was willing to continue organizing my life around. So you canceled the wedding. The wedding was an arrangement, he said. It was never a choice. Yejin's voice moved through her memory. I was always the arrangement and never the choice. You hurt someone, Zarya said quietly. Whatever the architecture of it was. Yes. No deflection, no qualification. I did. She respected this more than she wanted to. I still have a ticket, she said. I know. 10 days. I know. She looked at him, at the man who ran rooms with silence and remembered she didn't take coffee after 7, and had stood in her doorway on a Tuesday night, holding nothing except the stillness he carried everywhere, and had said, may I come in like a man asking permission for something considerably larger than entry to a 42-square-meter apartment. What are you asking me, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I'm asking you, he said carefully, to consider that what you built here, what you are here, is not something London can replicate, not because the position can't be replaced. He paused. Because you cannot. The room was very quiet. Outside, Seoul moved through its Friday night with its usual indifference to the private seismic events of the people living inside it. Zarya looked at the table, at the wine, at the man across from her who had just said, in the most controlled and precise way available to him, something that was not controlled or precise at all. I need to think, she said. I know, he said. She looked up. That's all you're going to say? I know? What would you like me to say? Something that tells me this isn't another arrangement. The pause that followed was the longest of the evening. Zarya, her name again, placed down carefully. I canceled a 20-year arrangement because you almost bought a plane ticket. I think that answers your question. She was quiet. Then, despite herself, despite the burgundy dress and the armor and 14 months of practiced invisibility, she laughed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a small, honest sound that surprised them both and changed the temperature of the room in a way that no amount of carefully chosen words had managed. He looked at her laugh like it was something he wanted to keep. She noticed. She let him. If you've made it this far and you still think Zarya should get on that plane, drop it in the comments. But if you think some things are worth staying for, like and subscribe, because Chapter 7 is where everything lands, and you do not want to miss it. She bought the ticket. Not the London one. She bought it 9 days later on a Sunday morning, sitting at the same desk where her resignation letter had once lived, where Hakjin's handwriting had once told her, in 7 precise words, that she had been seen long before she was ready to be. The ticket was to Lagos, 2 weeks, return. Her mother had been asking for 3 months, and Zarya had been deflecting for 3 months, and it occurred to her on that particular Sunday morning that she had spent so long being invisible inside other people's worlds that she had forgotten to be present inside her own. She booked the flight. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at her apartment, small, warm, honest, and thought about the conversation she needed to have before anything else could move forward cleanly. Monday arrived. 9 days. She had thought carefully over the weekend. Not the frantic, circular thinking of someone who couldn't find solid ground, but the deliberate, architectural thinking of a woman who understood that the most important decisions deserved the same rigor as the most important problems. She had walked along the Han River on Saturday morning. She had called her mother Sunday afternoon and not mentioned any of it, because some things needed to be decided before they were shared. She had slept well, finally, for the first time in a week. She arrived at the office at her usual time. Gray blazer. Because some things were constants. At 9 a.m., she knocked on his door. Come. She entered. Did not close the door behind her, because this was a professional conversation and she was conducting it in a professional register, and the distinction mattered to her even if the content of it was anything but routine. She stood in front of his desk. He looked up from his screen. Read her expression with the attention he brought to everything. Quiet, complete, missing nothing. "I've been thinking," she said. "I know," he said. "Stop saying that. It's accurate." She almost smiled, didn't. "I'm not withdrawing my resignation," she said. Something moved in his expression. She held up one hand, and the fact that he stopped, that Hak Jin-yoon, who stopped for no one, paused because she raised her hand, was itself information she filed quietly and carefully. "I'm not withdrawing it," she continued, "because the version of us that makes sense is not the version where I'm your assistant. That dynamic has a ceiling. It has a structure built into it that we've already outgrown, and pretending otherwise would make both of us smaller than we are." He was very still. "What I am willing to do," she said, "is help you find my replacement. Properly. Someone who deserves the role and can handle it. I'll give you 4 weeks instead of 2. A proper handover, full documentation, every contingency mapped." A pause. "And after 4 weeks?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "After 4 weeks, I go to Lagos for 2 weeks to see my mother, who I have been neglecting in favor of a career that has been, until recently, the most demanding relationship in my life." The corner of his mouth moved. Almost. "And after Lagos?" he said. "After Lagos," she said, "I come back to Seoul, not as your assistant, as someone who is figuring out what comes next." She held his gaze. "On my own terms, at my own pace, without a job description between us." The office was quiet. Outside the glass, the 31st floor moved through its Monday morning with the organized efficiency of a machine that did not know it was missing a part and was about to find out. Hak Jin looked at her for a long time. "That's your terms," he said. "Those are my terms. They're not negotiable." "No," she agreed. "They're not." Another pause. The kind that had weight and texture and the specific quality of a man doing the arithmetic on something and finding that the answer, while not what he would have written, was the only one he was willing to accept. 4 weeks, he said. 4 weeks. Lagos. 2 weeks. "And then Seoul," he said. Not a question. "And then Seoul," she confirmed. "We'll see what that looks like." He nodded once. Then, with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything, he picked up his pen and looked back at his screen. "Close the door on your way out, Miss Okoye." She stopped, turned back. "Zarya," she said quietly. He looked up. "You called me Zarya on Friday." Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical warmth that lesser men deployed when they wanted something. Just a small, honest movement, the kind that meant something precisely because it cost him. "Close the door on your way out," he said again. "Zarya," he added. She closed the door. 4 weeks passed with the specific quality of time that knows it is being counted. She found his replacement, a sharp, methodical woman named Bae Juayon, who had spent 6 years in international corporate security, and who, in her second interview, caught a scheduling conflict that 3 other candidates had missed. Zarya had looked at her across the table and thought, yes. She trained her for 3 weeks, documented everything, left nothing to interpretation or institutional memory. Built a handover so complete that the organization would not feel the seam. On her last official day, she arrived at the office at her usual time, wore the gray blazer one final time because it deserved the send-off, cleared her desk methodically, said goodbye to Minji, who cried, which Zarya had not anticipated and handled with the composed warmth of a woman who had never been as invisible as she'd believed. At 4:55 p.m., she knocked on his door. "Come." She entered, placed her access card on his desk, her security credentials, her system keys, everything clean, everything complete. He looked at the items, then at her. "It's done," she said. He stood, which he did not typically do. Hak Jin-yoon did not stand for departures any more than he stood for most things that other people performed as courtesy. He stood because he chose to, because this particular moment required it. He looked at her across the desk. "Lagos," he said. 2 weeks. "And then Seoul." "And then Seoul," she confirmed. He reached into his jacket and placed something on the desk beside her access card. A key. Small, unremarkable. She looked at it. "The Songbukdong house has a garden," he said. "It's better in spring." A pause. "You should see it." She looked at the key for a long moment, then at him, then she picked it up. It was warm from his pocket, small in her palm, the least dramatic object in the world, and somehow the heaviest thing she had held in 14 months. "I'll be back in 2 weeks," she said. "I know," he said. She laughed again. The same small, honest sound as Friday night, the one that had changed the temperature of a room. He looked at it the same way, like something he intended to keep. "You have to stop saying that," she said. "I'll consider it." She pocketed the key, picked up her bag, walked to the door. "Hakjin," she said without turning around. A pause. "Thank you," she said, "for noticing." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the fullest silence she had ever stood inside. She walked out. Down the corridor she had walked 5 days a week for 14 months, past Minji's desk, into the elevator, through the marble lobby that absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. Out into Seoul's evening, neon pressing against dusk, the city loud and alive and entirely indifferent to the private seismic events of the people moving through it. She stood on the pavement, breathed, felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific lightness of a woman who had stopped being invisible, not because the world had finally decided to see her, but because she had decided deliberately and on her own terms to be seen. She had a flight to Lagos in 36 hours. She had a key in her pocket. She had a city she was coming back to. And she had finally a story that was hers, not a job description, not a survival strategy, not 14 months of careful invisibility inside someone else's world. Hers. She walked into the evening. Seoul carried her forward. And that's the end. Zaria Okoye didn't fight for a man. She fought for herself, and that made all the difference. If this story moved you, if you've ever been the most capable person in a room and the last one anyone thought to choose, like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Tell me, was the key the best part, or was it the laugh? Because I think you already know the answer. See you in the next one.